What does ECHO expect from its partners in terms of integrating DRR perspectives into food assistance interventions?
I think all of our humanitarian assistance, including food assistance, should, the primacy, the first thing is to meet immediate humanitarian needs. But then the second thing, and this is where DRR comes into it, is we have to look at how do we avoid future situations? How do we avoid reoccurrence? Can we address the vulnerability that led people to be in this situation? And so what we expect is, and it's obviously context different, is that we analyze the situation to understand what are the risks that people face, why is it that pushed them into needing emergency help, and then seeing that whether we can, through our projects or with the assistance of others, reduce some of these causal reasons. For food security, that means trying to, how do we help people become more food secure? How do we manage them to help risk better?
How could DRR be integrated in the framework of food assistance interventions?
The first thing you have to do is to understand the local situation of risk and vulnerability. And for this, in our food assessments, we should incorporate a risk assessment as well. Now, and there are two parts to this. Not only to how do we protect the assistance we're giving, and by that we mean that, let's say it's a food distribution. What if the roads are going to be affected by rain? Do we have plans in place for this? If we are providing seeds to people, do we need to protect the seeds? And remember, in many places, let's say we're responding to a drought, the opposite to a drought is the floods that sometimes follow. So we have to be risk informed. But then we also need to look at how can we help people reduce the underlying vulnerability? How can we help people to change their cropping patterns? Is that necessary? We can have drought-resistant crops. Is there income diversification? Are there different markets? So we need to look at what the options there are to help people better in the longer term. And this means building on their capacities, what they do. And it's vitally important, and it's a critical part of disaster risk reduction, is actually doing no harm. And that's the same with all humanitarian assistance in general. When we provide food assistance at a very elevated level, we need to understand what's the impact we're going to have locally with this. If we are providing, as we said, food assistance, what does it do to a local market? Does this put the prices up? Does this make people who otherwise, they might be on a threshold, suddenly we're making them poorer because they can't afford something, or else we're flooding a market, which means they can't sell their produce. So we really have to be very risk informed. We have to understand what people are vulnerable to. And then what we want to be able to do is that we can make their livelihoods better, but then how do we respond? Can communities and vulnerable people actually manage better themselves? And so, when we talk about early warning systems, especially when it's a drought, but we have warnings of hurricanes, we have warnings of storms. Can we put in mechanisms so people can, let's say, protect their assets, protect their livelihoods as well? So for drought, this means things like, if we respond early, before the worst impacts are felt, can we have an early response? So what we do here is, for example, things like destocking of animals, veterinary services, early cash for work. In other words, let's help people sort of re-establish irrigation systems so that when the worst part of the drought comes, they're not going to be as badly effective. And we know that early response works. There are a number of studies. There's one from Oxfam, for example, where the cost of an early response is 7 times less than an actual response to drought. This actually means you can respond 7 times more, so you can respond 6 times, even if it's not necessary, and you'll still be cost effective. And think about this in terms of people. That means they don't suffer, it means that they don't diminish already threatened coping capacities, and they can actually develop more. And so there's a huge ethical issue here as well, because basically we typically know most of our humanitarian responses are in predictable places, in recurrent crisis and protracted crisis. So we know who's vulnerable, we know what they're vulnerable to, and we know that DRR, risk reduction, vulnerability reduction, works, and we should be doing more. And I think the good news is that all of the things I've spoken about risk assessment, we've talked about trying to work with local capacities, having a longer term approach. All of this is contained in our DRR policy. It's also contained in the resilience policy, but also the way we're implementing it. I'd advise everyone to look at the eco-resilience marker. The resilience marker is not terminology, it asks common sense questions for any context. Is your project risk informed? Do you protect your assistants? Do you work with capacities? Do you have a long-term vision? And the answer is all of these things should be considered everywhere we are and with all humanitarian assistance.